Thanks, everyone. I hope this is enough to keep the beautiful weather out of your minds for the next hour or so. So thanks so much for having me, for being here today. Just before I really dig into what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to give a little bit of background. So some of you in the class, or some of you here, sorry, I said class, geez. I'm actually on sabbatical right now, so I shouldn't be thinking about teaching. So some of you might know sort of what economists do, but I thought it might be a useful sort of introduction just to give a little glimpse about at least what academic economists do. Now, most of us, and I would include myself, my PhD's in economics, we sort of tend to think about like conceptualizing how the world works in some ways. Some of us are sort of theory-minded. We have a theory about how the world works. But most of us are actually empirically minded. We want to take some theory, some understanding that someone else has proposed, and we're going to test it or evaluate how true it is in some context, right? And for many economists, that context is simply like what's going on today in the world. Now, economic historians, such as myself, are slightly different in that our context just happens to be sometime in the past. So we use the same tools, the same methods, the same sort of theories, or testing the same theories as regular economists do, but we actually do that to investigate some historical context or question of interest. Now that may be, and as I hope to somewhat convince you over the next hour, be the case where these historical questions actually have a lot to say about modern policy issues. Now mine may seem a bit adjacent to that, or what I'll talk about here seem adjacent to it, but hopefully by the end you'll see what I mean in this particular example. So where do I fit in? I think Leila sort of nicely summarized my work. I work almost exclusively, somewhat oddly enough, if you will, or idiosyncratically, on late Imperial Russia. I have no family background. I sort of accidentally studied the language along the way. But my interests were really about understanding or looking historically at a place that could be compared in many ways to, say, a modern developing economy. Right? I just happen to work in this particular context. Now, why am I going to talk to you about serfdom and slavery? Now, some of you might know something about Russian history. We know that serfdom was a big deal, and I'll come to what it is in more detail in a bit. But it's actually a little more germane for this week because of this. So last Monday, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to these three gentlemen over here. And I think everyone can sort of read the description. Every year, the Nobel Prize in Economics is a bit weird. It's not given by the same entity that gives out all the other Nobels, but it's given by a sort of adjacent entity, and it's sort of lumped into the same. But the Nobel, they have some caricature artists. Every year, they do the same picture, or the same types of pictures of these guys. So these three gentlemen received the Nobel Prize, partly at least, for their work evaluating and thinking about what they call just institutions. Now, institution is a very generic and broad word, but roughly speaking, you can think of this as formal or informal things that sort of structure the rules of the game, the rules of the economy, the rules of a particular set of economic or non-economic interactions. And you can see here, the quote exactly is for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. So their work has been highly influential in sort of setting really a research agenda for an increasing number of scholars, and myself included. So the timing is somewhat germane for today. Now, I should say my topic, the serfdom and slavery sort of idea, or at least what I wanted to talk about, was simply this is an example of what we could call a bad institution, or an institution that's going to constrain achieving economic prosperity. Right? And that's about, serfdom and slavery are two words, a broader set of what you could call coercive or exploitative labor institutions. And that's what will be really underpinning what I talk about. Okay. I should say, and I mentioned this to Leila, my co-author is giving a different paper unrelated to the one today to two of these three guys right now, actually, in Chicago. Okay. So what I want to talk about today in sort of it's going to not necessarily go sequentially through these questions, but we'll sort of dip and dive our way. But sort of thinking about why these could be considered bad institutions. And again, institutions, just think about things that are going to structure the way actors interact in a very broad sense. Then I want to say, what are these things profitable? To some, the short answer is yes. Okay? If they were profitable to some, why abolish them? And I'll talk a lot about sort of the process of abolition that happened both in the Russian case but in other contexts as well. And then how did the way ending these institutions, this is really where my research is right now, how did the way ending these things subsequently affect these societies, affect the economies of these places going forward? And that will feed into the last point, or last sort of set of points I might be able to make here today about the long-term legacies of these institutions that we think, oh, they went away, in the 19th century or something, but many of their legacies are still with us today, as is maybe obvious. Okay, so just some definitional things to start off. So think of slavery. There's many, many definitions of slavery out there, but think of this as the ownership of one person by another person. And that means, for sort of the purely economist part of me, that's the ownership of their labor, right? What they produce with their labor is that product, that output goes to somebody else, right? But alongside that sort of strict ownership definition is there a bunch of other things that goes along with it, and often these involve a sort of differentiation between those who are enslaved and those who are the slaved owners, right? And that differentiation essentially means there's two separate groups in society, or many separate groups, but some of which are labeled slaves and some of which are not, right? Now, we know that this has been widespread throughout human history in many, many contexts. I just start with Rome, but there's slavery prior to Rome as well. One thing to note is that many of these early, and there was slavery in Europe, in Russia as well, prior, back in the early modern period. In those contexts, slavery wasn't defined as something that was racial in nature. Race wasn't existing as a concept, really, in the early modern period. That came to be a defining characteristic with the transatlantic slave trade, primarily, right? Such that by the time we get to American sort of U.S. slavery in the 18th, 19th centuries, that is, race becomes the defining feature of, again, separating these two groups, right? So keep that in mind, again, as we go through. So from an economist perspective, slavery is one thing for one group. Those that own the slaves benefit, obviously, in a purely economic sense, by being able to have very cheap labor, right? And that cheap labor means they get a lot more from the product of the slaves than they have to pay or expend to maintain the slaves, right? I'm going to show a bunch of figures. I should have said that up front. I'm just going to show a bunch of pictures of a bunch of research of economic historians on these topics, some of which are pictures that I've produced, some of which are pictures by others, including a colleague at Williams. I'll mention when I get there. So this is just a picture. You can think of each dot here as like a part of the Americas. And on the left hand, the y-axis is how many slaves were brought over in the transatlantic slave trade to that place in the Americas. And then when, or over some period of time, what was the wage like in those places? And so think of this, slaves are not paid a wage, that hopefully is well known, but the workers in those places, the free workers, if there were a lot of slaves brought over, those workers would have also received low wages. Those who took some economics might remember you just push out a supply curve and it's going to lower the price, right? So this is ignoring the fact that the slaves themselves aren't receiving very much compensation, right, at all, right? And so again, the slave owners, those who own those individuals, are going to benefit a lot by being able to produce a lot of output but not being forced to pay a lot there. Okay? Now that does not take into account, just to be clear, all the other social, emotional, cultural costs borne by the slaves. And I might be able to say at the end some attempts at estimating what those costs were, at least in the US case, in recent years. Okay. So if those who own the slaves benefited a lot from having these individuals under their control, right, there's new work and new evidence that suggests that those profits, the difference between what the slaves can produce and what the slave owners are spending on them, right, what role did those profits play in the economy, right? Which has been a sort of a theme of what you could call this new history of American capitalism in the American case. I actually don't have much to say about that, but there's brand new work by economic historians that point out that there's actually a direct connection between the profits that British slave owners received and industrialization of Britain. So if you know your British industrial history, which I expect everyone to know, right, this area up here, which is sort of Manchester and Liverpool, is where sort of the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see here, when slavery is abolished in the British Empire, slave owners, many of whom resident in England, right, received compensation from the British government. And that compensation happened to hit, or I mean, you could think of the people that owned the slaves were in these places that also were industrializing. And this particular work, which is actually still a working paper right now, shows that it tries to map out that there's a connection between the profits received from slavery, from involvement in the Caribbean slave trade and use of slaves, and subsequent British industrialization, at least in terms of the geography of the industrialization. Right? I should say, this is just one example of the type of work people are doing to figure out what was really the impact of slavery on the ground. I'll come back to the US case towards the end. But there are many other types of coercive labor systems in history, and I work not so much on slavery, which again was something that existed in the Russian Empire, but on this other thing called serfdom. And the way I think serfdom being different, I mean, one is that race, at least in my context, is not part of the equation, right? But this is one where peasants are actually tied to the land, not to the individual who owns the land necessarily, but the individual who owns the land, because of their ownership of the land, gets access to this, again, cheap source of labor, right? And the cheap source of labor comes either directly in the form of labor or by cash or other types of obligations paid to the owner, right? Now, there's also, in many contexts, and serfdom varies widely across Europe during European history at least, and you could talk about things like serfdom elsewhere. There's all sorts of other sort of differences between those who are serfs and those who are the serf owners or the land owners that serfs reside upon. But those aren't really often very identifiable differences. There are differences in social class, there are differences in obviously in wealth and income and status to some extent, but not necessarily a difference in ethnicity, or I already mentioned race, or even in religion or anything like that. There are cases where serfs were different from the serf owners, but not always, or not even usually the case, and that particularly in the Russian context, that's true. Right? Now, in many cases, there are serfs who are resident on privately owned estates. Those are sort of the classic form of what we call serfdom. And there were peasants who were resident on, say, land owned by the state itself, or land owned by the imperial family, in whatever context we talk about. Those, in many cases, I'm just sort of foreshadowing what I'm going to talk about in a bit. Those peasants might experience have a different set of experiences than those that are directly, potentially exploited by an individual and maybe unmonitored landlord. Okay. So again, I mentioned this was common in Europe, particularly prior to the Black Death in the 14th century, and then it disappears across Western Europe. You think of this as like, again, basic economics. Black Death means a lot of deaths of workers, and therefore the value of workers goes up a lot, and they're sort of essentially able to bargain away the sort of serf status, if you will. Serfdom goes away in the West. But strangely enough, for a variety of complicated reasons, serfdom doesn't go away and actually is sort of reborn in much of Central and Eastern Europe. That includes Prussia, which I'll talk about in a bit, and my context, Imperial Russia. Right? And in fact, in the Imperial Russian case, serfdom, after the sort of from the mid-17th century on, actually comes to fully displace slavery that had existed prior to that. Now, just as a little aside, why am I talking about this today? So Why Nations Fail is the name of a book that was written by two of those three Nobel Prize winners a few years ago. And they have this little blurb in it where they're talking about the fact that this particular institution, they're talking about serfdom in this case, was highly extractive, meaning there was, essentially the serfs themselves, a lot of their product was being pulled away by the owners of the serfs. And that was a main reason why Russia was so poor prior to 1917, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. So they've identified this. There's zero evidence in the book to support this fact, but I was like, hey, there's, that's good. Something I can explore. Okay. So just to give you a bit of evidence here, and I apologize, usually on these slides I do have what the source is, at least just the reference. This one, for some reason, I forgot to put it there. This is just the original source, not the particular paper this comes from. But what you can see here is places, societies in Europe that had serfdom throughout this period, from the 14th to the 19th century, are much more agrarian. Much more of the population is in agriculture. Now, you might think, well, of course, if they have serfdom, agriculture. But the story here is that this is a causal. There's something about serfdom is constraining people to stay in what is increasingly, as industries taking hold, is something that's the more backward sector, right? The poor sector. And those societies that sort of escape, the Western European ones that escape serfdom, are much more developed, much more industrialized. Right? So, thinking about serfdom and thinking about slavery has, in the last 15 or so years, generated a huge amount of research, comparative research. People who are thinking about one society, like myself with Imperial Russia, but often have other places in mind or some really interesting comparisons where things sort of looked similar, right? This isn't new, but it is new, at least from the perspective of people that do sort of the economic history like I do. But I want to mention real quickly, in case you're curious, there's some a fascinating 2 books written by a historian who is now retired from the University of Delaware, Peter Coercion, who explicitly drew out this comparison. The first book was written in 1987, and it won the Bancroft Award, which is like the best book in history that year. So it's an explicit comparison of what was slavery like, what was serfdom like, with an explicit discussion of the key difference, and very much the most important difference being that one was racially defined and one was not. Right? Now, as of 3 weeks ago, he has a new book that's about the process of ending these regimes and comparing them explicitly. And this is really where I enter the picture, because my research is about understanding how the process of unraveling these mattered. All right? But before we get there, we might want to ask ourselves, well, why did these societies actually end these regimes? Because again, if there's a lot of individuals who are benefiting, the owners of the slaves or owners of the land that serfs reside upon are benefiting from this regime, wouldn't they resist it? And aren't they the ones that have the political power to do so? In fact, the 3 Nobel Prize winners, Daron Acemoglu, James Robinson, and Simon Johnson, much of their research is about how those who gain from a particular economic institution can then control the political levers to keep that power and keep that economic institution in place, even if it is a bad institution from a sort of broader society perspective. So here you see, and this is actually, unfortunately I cut it off, this is actually from another paper by that Peter Coercion, where he's explicitly trying to understand the dynamics of why different societies emancipated or abolished these institutions at different points in time. Okay. A key takeaway that you can, I'm going to walk through a couple examples now. A key takeaway is simply that context matters. And there's a lot of specificity to why one society got rid of serfdom and another society got rid of slavery, or at least tried to initiate the process. So first off, thinking about the UK itself. Now, there wasn't much in the way of slavery directly in the United Kingdom in the, say, 18th century. But there's a widespread and growing abolition movement in the early 19th century that culminates in sort of empire-wide abolition in 1833, and then that compensation of the slave owners in the empire that I mentioned. Right? So you can see on the left here is the sort of rise, and by the 1830 to 33, the sort of hemorrhage, lots and lots of petitions about to end slavery. And some of these are going to parliament, some of these are just in the newspaper. A variety of entities are signing or putting their names on sort of pieces of paper that says we should end this institution. In this particular paper, which again I forgot to put the citation on, which is another working paper, in this case by sort of historically minded political scientists at Stanford, notes that places that had a lot of coal mines or water mills, which are the early sort of signs of industrialization in England, were the ones that were more likely, you can think of this as how likely they are, to petition to end slavery. So if you think of 2 types of places in the UK, some set of places have these early bits of industrialization, and some don't. The ones that have industrialization seem to be the ones that are more anti-slavery. And that is a little weird if we thought about the stuff I showed you earlier, which is that the places that were more sort of tied to the slave trade and to slavery were the ones that industrialized more. But what's interesting is the ones who benefit from slavery itself are typically the merchants, those who own land in the Caribbean, right? Many of them tend to be residents, say, in Manchester or Liverpool. But the industrialists who are who are part of the Industrial Revolution in the UK are different. They are not ones, and they feel that for a variety of reasons, that largely on moral grounds, many of these are, say, Quakers, or feel for religious reasons that slavery is bad, they're the ones who increasingly hold sway in this society. And you could think about this as the landed elite who had owned slaves throughout the British Empire no longer have the political power. And they can't maintain the bad institution anymore, given that there's a rise of a new elite, and a new elite that, for a variety of reasons, thinks that progress means we are getting rid of this antiquated institution. So they're supporting abolition. In Brazil, which abolishes, if you remember the list, I meant to highlight it, but I forgot. It's at the bottom here. Brazil abolishes in 1888 formally, although it begins slightly earlier. You can see the distribution of where slaves were in Brazil on the left-hand side in 1872. On the right, it's actually the vote, the final vote over the act that's going to end slavery in Brazil. And a lot of people didn't show up to vote. Those are all the gray areas. The white areas are those who representatives in this assembly voted to end slavery. And the little red area which is Rio de Janeiro, effectively, they're the holdouts. They're the ones that want to maintain or keep slavery. And this paper, which is, again, a working paper, one of the scholars is actually at a different NASCAC institution. I'll just say that. They argue that the thing that made Rio different, and prior to this, the resistance was coming from other places as well, was that Rio did not have many, at this time, immigrants, i.e. substitutes for slave labor. And Rio was not near places where runaway slaves had long sort of fled to. I won't try to pronounce the Portuguese word. There's a word for these communities. They still are well known and sort of recognized today in Brazil. But these communities of runaway slaves were not really close to Rio. And so you could think of if there would be communities close to Rio where slaves could run away to, then that's really hard for slave owners in that context to maintain control of their slaves. And so in that world, maybe you're more willing, if it's really costly to maintain slavery, I might be more willing to give it up. Right? Or if there's a lot of immigrants I can hire instead at relatively low wages, I might be more willing to vote for abolition. So again, this is social science work that's trying to unpack quantitatively what the history is underpinning this particular change. Finally, I promise I'm moving along fairly quickly here. Prussia. So why talk about Prussia? So Prussia also has serfdom, say right around 1800, the beginning of the 19th century. But very quickly they abolish it. On the left, up there is a map of Prussia. If you remember from some European history class in the past, maybe at Williams, Prussia's like divided into two parts with a bunch of weird little states in between, right? And so there's differences across Prussia in sort of the extent of which abolition is happening. Abolition of serfdom in this case, not slavery, right? And the reason I bring up this paper is this is a brandly new published paper by a colleague of mine, Kamal Ashraf, here at Williams. He's the Ashraf there, and 4 other authors, that investigates why did some areas abolish in some ways more quickly than other areas in the Prussian context. And what they find is that those areas where the owners of serfs had other assets, things like, in this case, water mills, were more likely to abolish earlier. Why is that? Well, it turns out the argument they put forth in their paper is that if those, say, serf owners who had some other capital, a water mill, if they abolish, it's actually beneficial to them because those workers will be more productive if they're free. And that's for 2 reasons. One, they might just be better incentivized. They can gain more. And you can apply them to that capital you have, that mill you have. But at the same time, if they're free, they're incentivized to maybe acquire human capital, to educate themselves, right? Because they can see the returns to that. In the case of serfs, they may not be able to because the serf owner might just take those returns away, that higher wage away. And it's in the case in Germany at this time that increasingly it pays, if you own a factory, it pays to have a slightly more educated workforce, right? And so those serf owners who also say owned a factory, here approximated again by like watermill, it paid for them. It was profitable for them to actually abolish, to move towards abolishment, because those serfs would be just better workers now that they're free. Right? That's their argument they put forth in this paper. And that means that there's a persistence, there's more, the other figures are just sort of trapped here because I cut it out from the paper. But this is watermills always on the bottom here, how many watermills there are in a locality. And these are how industrialized the place is, different measures. So that persistence, those places remain more industrialized well into the 19th century. Right? So it's got a compounding effect on German industrialization, is the point. Okay. Now, unfortunately, in the Russian context, we don't really have good data that allows us to investigate why abolition of serfdom happened when it did in the ways it did. Partly because serfdom in Russia really is something done from the very top. It's something that's initiated by Tsar Alexander I, largely because they lose the Crimean War. And they lose it partly because they don't have very good weapons, they don't have the resources brought to bear. It's really hard for them to get troops down to the Black Sea where the Crimea is. Same thing's still happening for Russia today, right? And as a result, he just essentially dictates one day, we're gonna end this from above because we don't want them to essentially rebel from below. That's the sort of a paraphrase of his famous quote, right? But I can still show you a map. So we know the distribution of, and this is just European Russia. You can think of the edge there on the right-hand side is where the Ural Mountains are. Siberia is beyond there. On the left-hand side here is essentially Poland and Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. Okay? So this is the distribution of where this particular type of peasant was right on the eve of emancipation, which happens in 1861. Notice the similarity there. It's 1861 in Russia and 1864, at least legally in the United States. That's why Kolchin was motivated to write the books that he's written. So this is the geography, and you can see there's quite a bit of variation on where serfs were located across at least European Russia. The units here are equivalent to Russian or US counties. Think of them like that. Right? The people who are not included, the non-serfs, again, are other peasants who are residing on other sorts of land, for the most part. There's not many urban residents in Russia in the middle of the 19th century. It's about 9% of the population. So the other 91% are peasants. About half of them are serfs. The other half are resident in just land owned by the state, and that generally meant that their conditions were a little better. It's that variation on the experience of peasants after the reforms that end this institution is what I sort of leverage. Yeah, you want a question? Sure. No, and I will show you some signs of that. Thank you. But I do leverage this distribution in sort of exploring what the impact was of ending serfdom. Okay, so again, it ends in 1861 by manifesto. The Tsar just declares it. It's over in February of 1861. Now, the problem is, between 1861 and 1880s, they are figuring out how, remember, serfs are peasants who are tied to the land. How are we going to divide out that land on each estate? And there's about 110 to 120,000 separate estates. We have to figure that out for every separate estate. It's going to be an individual estate-by-estate process, essentially, right? And so that's a very complicated set of reforms. And I'll explain how those worked in a second. And then, but over this time period, the same time period, all the way into the 20th century, we're going to have a persistent sort of difference between those peasants who were serfs, had been subject to these individual gentry, these noble landlords in the countryside, and those peasants who were not subject to this. Now, those peasants who are not serfs, they go by different labels: state peasants, court peasants. Some of them are on the Romanov family land, actually. they just get the same deal they had before. It takes a slightly different form, and I'll explain why in a second. But more or less, nothing changes for them. So a co-author of mine has noted that the legislation that ends this, and there's a lot of legislation that ends this, it's quite complicated, seems to have just made the conditions of serfdom even worse, if anything. Has made the economy is going to be constrained going forward because we didn't fix things very well in 1861. Right? And might even make peasants worse off. And this is not a new idea. She was writing in the early 2000s. We've written a little bit of work that explores this together. Tracy Dennison's actually a dean at Caltech right now. But Lenin himself sort of asked the question, did 1861 beget 1905? And by 1905, he really meant 1917. So he really meant, did the revolution, the fact that we had a revolution here, stem from the fact that this didn't work out very well in 1861? Okay, how did it not work out well? And so here I have to give you a little bit of details. So I've done a bit of archival work in Russia. Haven't actually used a lot of it in my own actual research, but it's still fun to look at pictures of. So what they had to do was a sort of multi-stage process. So the Tsar issues the manifesto that ends serfdom. That's sort of like, you guys are free now, great. But how is this going to work in practice? So what they, again, have to figure out is how to divide, there's an estate, how do we figure out who gets what on this estate? And unlike, say, I'll take just the case of American slavery, right? In American slavery, the land is going to stay with the white plantation owners, right? And then they're going to maybe figure out the sort of ex-slaves might be able to rent, they might share crop, they might actually be able to buy somehow some of that land, but they're not going to get anything, right? In this context, there actually is going to be a division of the land, and there's very, very complicated rules about how that happens. But the first order of business is simply to find out what is serfdom like on your estate. How much land do the serfs have access to, say, to grow their own crops? How much labor do they have to provide to the serf owner? How many chickens do they have to give every year? How many bales of hay do they have access to, and so on and so forth? So for every single estate, they had to come up with this type of document, which is just a written set of what the conditions were like on the estate. And this process takes about 3 years. And in fact, one interesting side fact is Tolstoy was one of the officials that they created a class of officials called, in Russian it translates as peace mediators. And Tolstoy was one of these in the early 1860s. And so for every single state, they have to come up with what was serfdom, right? But then, once that's established, then the statutes take hold, and we're going to translate what serfdom was on every single state to the new regime. And the new regime is going to be, some land is going to be given to the peasants. Some land is going to be kept by the former serf owner, right? And the peasants are going to have to pay for the land they receive in the form of essentially sort of a mortgage loan that's financed by the state. Super complicated, and it's much more complicated than that, right? But to do this, they then have to agree on what that new mortgage deal will be going forward, and that's a whole nother set of bargaining, and that, from 1864, lasts all the way into the 1880s. There's estates where they haven't figured out how to do this in 1883, and then the state sort of says, everyone's just got to do it now. It's enough is enough, okay? And so in ongoing work, I'm actually exploring, you can't read any of this, that's okay. I'm actually exploring the individual deals that finally set the terms for what the land arrangement will be going forward. So how much land do the peasants get? How much land does the estate owner get? And how much do the peasants have to pay for what they get? And what's interesting here, particularly interesting in this context, I'll actually use my pointer here, is this right here, which I'm benefiting from the fact you can't read this. But what this here is simply who initiated the contract, who agreed to it. In this case, all three of these are three separate estates here. All three of these, it was a mutual agreement. And because it was a mutual agreement, the statutes that the state set down actually didn't apply. They could do anything. The peasants could be forced to pay 1 billion rubles if they agreed to it. Okay? The statutes, in theory, circumscribed how the deal could arrange. And if the landlord wanted to force through the deal, I want my payments now, and the payments came in terms of bonds the state gave to the landlords, then they would have to take a haircut. They would have to take less. The serfs would get more, get a slightly better deal. If the serfs wanted to push through the deal, they would have to give up more. The landlord would receive more. So sort of a very complicated, and again, there's like 120,000 of these deals going on throughout European Russia. Right? Now, what this means, and I should just point out the sort of the little tweak here, is that the land the peasants get has a special legal status. It can't really be alienated to others outside the community, and they receive it as a community, not in the form of individual property rights. So there's no specific, like, you know, Ivan Ivanov gets that plot of land over there for his new farm. It's no, the village of Ivanova, the names are highly restricted in the Russian context. So we know they get like 100 acres total, right? But we're not going to specify who gets what acreage in that. It's all up to the community. So there's both a community definition of the property rights and a community liability, a collective liability to pay for the land going forward. And then the state sort of adds on a collective liability to pay taxes and to provide conscripts and a variety of other things. So this collectivity, Dickinson, the quote I showed you earlier, what she's really referring to, this institutional structure, is this reinforced or formalized communal structure of the Russian countryside, where the village takes on this extra legal authority that it sort of quasi had before, but not in a strict legal sense. Okay? Now that means that land that's given over you can't do much with it, but over time peasants are able to acquire some land. So what you have here is the change in land held by the nobility on the left-hand side, and the change in private land, not what I was just talking about, but private land held by the peasants on the x-axis between the 1870s and 20th century. And you see this negative correlation. Basically, the nobility are losing land over time, and the peasants are buying it when they can. Right? So the peasants are substituting the fact that they are restricted and constrained by these settlements. They try to get around in a variety of ways. This is one example. But as the question alluded to before, the punchline is that you can compare these serfs prior to the reform and after, all the way in 1905, and the unit here is those counties. So this is like an average for every county, is that serfs get less land than other types of peasants going forward. And that's still true. The difference between the first two lines and the second two lines there, simply that's per soul. Think of that as an adult male. And this is per household. So roughly it's doubled. You can see the amount stays the same per person, roughly. And the serfs always have less of it than the other types of peasants. And that's like legally put in place, and that stays that way into the 20th century. Moreover, and maybe I'll skip this over, but it turns out the places that have more serfs have more inequality in land holdings down the road. And that's partly because these landowners, these private land, the gentry retain, even though many of them give up some of their land, they retain large holdings in those areas where they exist. Okay, so there's more inequality. The serfs have less land, but at the same time, they're paying more. I should mention that, but the process of giving the land over to the peasants was called redemption. The peasants are really enough going to redeem their land from the state / the nobility. These redemption payments are higher for serfs than they are for the non-serfs, here just lumped in the labeled state peasantry. Okay? The state peasants undergo a very similar process, but again, they just had their existing deals and they just kept going with it. Right? You might wonder what a desyatina is. It's 2.74 acres. So it's just a land unit, don't worry. Okay. All right. So that sort of circumscribes the ability of the peasantry, again, remember 90% of the population, to sort of both commercialize and expand and improve productivity in agriculture, and the collectivity of the community, the collective liability for taxes and land payments, right? And this collective property right that I can't necessarily extract myself from, right, has always been or long been labeled sort of a key set of constraints on agricultural development going forward, right? I don't have private property rights, so why would I invest in my land, right? I am stuck with this collective liability, so I can't leave for a better labor market opportunity elsewhere. Right? But additionally, there's other sort of, having been a serf prior to 1861 is something that's continued to be recognized going forward in a variety of ways, right? Here's just two little quick examples. These are two very different places. Poltava is now in the Ukraine. Vladimir is near Moscow province. These are townships, which are subunits of counties. And the reason I bring these up is in these places, in 1881 here and in 1904 here, an individual village was still recognized, I'll go over here in this particular township, as being either, this means, this particular ending here means formerly a state peasant village. But right above it here, this was formerly the village of Vasikovoy, or Vasikova, meaning the owner. So the identity, are you still a serf, or were you a serf village, or were you a non-serf village, is still recognized and known at this late in the game. And those have a bunch of things we can't measure, a bunch of restrictions, a bunch of potential constraints that were maybe more binding for those former serfs than for the non-serfs, right? And this is where we can sum up what's going on here. So basically you end serfdom, but you have a continuation of a bunch of constraints on the development of this very rural agrarian economy. Okay? That might be the peasants can't move elsewhere for better things, and they can't really improve their land and therefore, grow crops to sell and so on. These constraints very explicitly were this communal structure. There are also this differentiation in the types of property that peasants had relative to other people in society, the private land. And there's a whole bunch of other things that just made it hard for peasants to move around. In fact, if you moved more than 30 miles or 30 kilometers away, you had to have a passport that gets stamped, and you had to pay a fee. Right? These things are real constraints on improving the economy from a development economist perspective. Right? Okay, so why am I talking about this? Well, I wrote a paper that came out a few years ago. The title, somewhat cleverly maybe, is The Slow Road from Serfdom, Labor, Coercion, and Long-Run Development in the Former Russian Empire, where we essentially took this argument and tried to test it out with data. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the data stuff, but it's pretty simple. Serfdom constrained labor mobility. That's almost by definition, because I'm a serf, therefore I'm not really incentivized to produce a lot more because it could just be taken away, right? I'm not going to really increase agricultural production very much. So the fact that some areas of Russia had more serfdom than other areas, peasants residing on these types of estates relative to other areas, meant that we have this geographic pattern emerge where serf areas are poor prior to abolition. And then I've just illustrated to you why there could be a variety of reasons why that geography might persist in the decades following 1861. And then the paper walks through a whole bunch of reasons why it turns out this geography persisted throughout the 20th century, and into actually the 21st century. And what we show in these data is areas that were more serf in 1858, right, have 20% lower consumption per capita today, right? There's no reason, going into this project, I was like, no, we're not going to find anything. That's nonsense, right? Given all the chaos that was the Soviet experiment. But we find this sort of persistent geography linked back to this coercive labor institution in the past. But it was really about creating this initial set of conditions that constrain things and then perpetuating similar constraints going forward that continued to keep some areas poorer than other areas, right? Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay, 10 minutes? Sure. Okay, now, similar sort of persistence arguments, something happened in the past, we see after effects today, has been explored for such coercive labor institutions in a variety of other contexts. This is one example from a famous paper that came out in 2010, Melissa Dell's at Harvard, that explored what was called the Mita in Peru, which was really an area that was supplying labor, right in here it is, to Potosi and to this place, which I can't pronounce, which were silver mines. So during the Spanish after the conquest of the Incan Empire, right, they set up this institution where essentially you had to supply labor to these mines if you were in this area. And what she shows in the paper is in that area, you can see it's right here blowing up, consumption levels are lower, and there's more child stunting. Right? And she has then a bunch of the paper, which is good social science, is trying to understand why. Why was there something that happened so far long ago? And in this case, it's 300 plus years ago. Why do we still see these after effects today? Right? So to get at that a little bit more, I do want to sort of end here by talking about slavery as we think about it, okay? Move away from the Russian context. So we know that slavery has had long-run consequences in Africa. Those places that had more slaves extracted over the centuries of the transatlantic slave trade are poor today. That's the correlation you see here. There's a variety of mechanisms at work, a variety of reasons why this is 2018 data you see here, right? Why you see this long-run effects. And it's mostly about the conflict and the sort of mistrust generated through slaving in Africa having these sort of intergenerational consequences. Right? But if we think about the United States, right, what is the impact of this institution in the US? There's just been an explosion of work in the last 20 years that has tried to sort of understand this. Now, we know, and I've already said, that slaves upon emancipation don't receive anything, right? Which is actually one weird thing that's sort of different in the Russian context, right? But what I want to walk through really quickly is that, okay, they don't receive anything, but there is a set of sort of economic things at work immediately after 1864, and more importantly, perhaps, there's a set of political factors at work that are going to illustrate how, capture the political system by powerful economic agents can lead to the persistence of bad institutions in, again, sort of a differentially labeled form, right? So in terms, we end a system where there's owners of the slaves in the South who are not compensated directly, unlike the British case, right? Don't have resources pulled away, except for, in some cases, some of the former Confederate elite do have resources pulled away. But they're still, the ones who are left, who have the land, are trying to reconstitute the labor relations that they had before, right? They are trying to have labor work on their estates, right? Work on the plantations throughout the South. Now, it turns out that is a really complicated thing. I've mentioned, one second. I mentioned sharecropping, I mentioned rental contracts, I mentioned there's wage labor attempts. Recent work, and this is actually a scholar at Yale Law School, has explored how the contracting for labor immediately after the end of the Civil War took a very different form depending on whether on the left, the Freedmen's Bureau was involved, or on the right, it was just a bespoke one-on-one contract between the former plantation owner and the former slave, right? And it turns out the ones on the right, not surprisingly, are much more exploitative agreements. So the places where the Freedmen's Bureau could sort of monitor more, and they use variation on where the Freedmen's Bureau was present throughout the South, were able to put somewhat better conditions in place. Yeah, you have a question? Go ahead.
Any data that correlates where the British Manchester owned slaves and where they were located in America?
Well, that would be entirely in the Caribbean, generally speaking, not in the U.S. South. But the people that are working on that, I think they don't quite. It's very complicated how they do that map. I can explain afterwards if you want. But this goes away. How does this go away? It goes away because things like the Freedmen's Bureau are in quite quickly in the South. So in Reconstruction, right, there's actually, there's a sort of brief window of time when you have, and this is just showing what could have been the alternative path, you have black politicians that emerge throughout the South. And those places with black politicians in the 1870s, right, are generally speaking spending more money on public goods, on education provision, on public health, on all sorts of things that are benefiting the local population, right? 1880, those black politicians are no longer politicians in those places at the end of Reconstruction, and the spending plummets per capita on those types of public goods that would benefit a wide group of people. And that decline is even worse in places where the black politicians, where there's more violence, right? There's this reaction, obviously, by the white Southerners against this political regime, right? This political system, Reconstruction, and that reaction is what really takes hold, okay? There's this persistence of the white planter elite, and this is, again, I'm illustrating this through new work by economic historians here. So this is the case of Texas. It turns out even by 1900, over half of the delegates of the Texas state legislature essentially have direct ties to slavery, right? So it's sort of the same people are still continuing to be in charge. What are those people doing? So turns out those people are consolidating political control in the South. This is a story we all know, a story that Charles Dew, many of you might be aware of Charles Dew here, who was a historian at Williams for decades, right? This is the story he told in many of the classes, right? How the South became the place it was over time after the Civil War, right? And it was essentially through political control of these economic elite that had these pre-Civil War sort of roots. Okay? This is the correlation between how the share of the population who were slaves, again, that map I showed you, and the vote for Democrats by presidential election over time. And you can see after the Civil War ends, this is, after Reconstruction ends, that number, again, remember, Democrats were like on the right, if you will, back then, right? And it peaks here, right, where there's just a really high correlation between where slavery was and votes for Democrats, right? The correlate here is that the black population is disenfranchised over this time. And that ebbs slowly and then goes away. The difference goes away, or the correlation goes away once you get the Voting Rights Act, and then obviously it's negative with Obama, okay, because more enslaved areas in the South, by the time you get to 2008, are still places where they have more African Americans today, and as a result, they're more likely to vote for Obama. Right? So that correlation reverses. But this is really a story in the US case, as it sort of is in the Russian context, if I had more time, about the persistence of political control of these elites who have an interest in keeping a particular institutional structure afloat. And that institutional structure is Jim Crow. Right? And so this is the rise on the right of Jim Crow laws that apply to labor control. So as the white sort of political elite in the South consolidates control, they pass these laws that restrict black labor freedom in the South. Okay? This is from a brand new paper that sort of estimates what the effects were by actually comparing areas that did not have the free blacks in the South to blacks that were enslaved. What we know is this is all the backdrop for a long-run persistence of racial differences in income and racial differences, in this case, in wealth. Right? Now, yes, there's if you start from one group having essentially zero wealth, at least measurable wealth, non-human capital wealth, right, at the end of the Civil War, right, that's like the denominator, so big numerator, small denominator is going to be a big number, right? That number starts to get non-zero in the denominator, and you're going to, over time, see it move, but I can tell you, 2020 today, that gap is still 6 to 1, right? Per capita wealth gap in the U.S. This is work by Yelena Durancourt, who's at Princeton. I'm almost done, don't worry. And obviously this is the after effects that we see in the case of this coercive labor system in the United States. This is the persistence of these racial differences in economic outcomes in a variety of forms. This is just one example. Right? And that has led to some thinking by economists and economically history-minded economists, particularly Bill Darity at Duke, to how do we think about broad-based policies to deal with this gap, right? And in his case, he wants to think about actual, to be explicit, reparations. And he has a recent paper that just estimates this, just thinking about the differences, the cost, the extra cost borne by the enslaved population that was not priced in. Think about the cost of violence, the cost of social exclusion and everything prior to the Civil War. And these are the types of numbers he gets. If you compound that at 3% until 2021, these are various ways to think about this. But again, this is not about Jim Crow or anything after 1860 and the differences you see there. This is just to the Civil War. And you can see we're talking in numbers, in his big numbers here, trillions of dollars would be what essentially African Americans faced, the cost they bore, the extra cost they bore prior to the Civil War, right? So again, I told you a story with the Russian context. There's like lower consumption in the Russian case for areas that had more former serfs. But in that case, again, serfs were not ethnically, racially, religiously really different from the serf owners. In this case, there is a big difference, right, that has persisted over time, and a difference that's defined by race in the US context. So, just to summarize, and I think I am definitely out of time, perfect actually, right? So, work of a variety of economic historians, a little smidgen by myself, but by others even at Williams. I should have mentioned my colleague Anand Swamy has also done work on coercive labor institutions in South Asia. Has really showed how these institutions work and how unraveling or ending these institutions has been both long and hard and generally speaking, not like often like super beneficial in terms of alleviating negative economic conditions, right? There's been slow progress in some dimensions, right? But by slow, we're talking centuries to take. And as a result, we live with the after effects of these things that, you know, in our day-to-day lives today, we don't necessarily think mattered. Or maybe don't think mattered, but they are there, sort of under the surface, right? Thanks. So I guess we have time for questions. People want to complain.
We do have mic runners. I'm one, and my colleague Jordan is another. And Jordan, there's actually a question right behind you.
Yes. So how did right here? How did a Russian peasant first become a serf? And as a corollary, what was the relationship between the landowner and the serf that corresponds to a slave owner in the United States?
Excellent question. So serfdom sort of has a long and slow ramp up. Essentially, it's a series of things over time where the peasants, peasants are just out there, they're residing on land. And the land is given, say, from the czar to a particular nobleman, often in return because he did some service for him. And that land just happens to have 50 villages on it. And that happens throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, into the 19th century. As Russia sort of expands away, Muscovy expands to Imperial Russia, sort of away from Moscow. It's those land grants of various forms that sort of consolidated that, at least the formal control. I am a nobleman and I have the land that 7 villages are on, right? 1649 has the formal legal conditions. Oh, you are a peasant on land owned by or granted by the czar to the landowner. Therefore, you are constrained. You cannot move without permission. You are also obligated to do X, Y, and Z for the land, for the owner of the land. So that's the sort of formal way that peasants become members of, become serfs over time. There's some weird cases. For example, monasteries are granted the same sort of control. And there's lots and lots of monasteries, it turns out. But in 1769, I'm going to slightly fudge, I don't remember the exact year, Catherine the Great actually expropriates the monasteries and turns all those peasants into state peasants. Basically, now that land is state land, not monastic land. And there's lots of stories the monastic peasants were particularly badly exploited, interestingly enough. Those peasants actually sort of do better over time as a result of this sort of getting off the yoke of the monasteries. But that creates, that's actually a huge amount of peasants. It's like 20% of the peasantry gets shifted from one category to another. And those are a big part of the state peasants by the time you get to 1864 or 58. Yeah. I sort of got through most of your question, I think. Apologize if I didn't get it all there. Yeah,
Hi there, thank you for that. So here's my question. In the United States, by 1860, if you look at the extractive, if you talk about the slavery economy, you had rice, tobacco, sugar, and cotton. And so obviously they made a lot of money, but then everything that went to the textiles, the bankers, the insurance companies, the North had a huge stake in it.
Yeah.
And when you look at the hundreds of millions of pounds of cotton that was shipped over to Europe, it was a big economy. If you look at what percent of the export slavery-related extractive products were, I've seen numbers by 1860 of like 50%, something in that order of magnitude. What is your best estimate of what its impact was on the GDP of the country at that point?
Well, I haven't done any estimates, but I can say that recent work, and there's some new work by Rick Hornbeck at Chicago and Trevon Logan at Ohio State, that argues that the number you'd get in GDP, in some weird sense, isn't that big. It's about 4%. But the problem with GDP is only priced things.
Right.
And so you're excluding all the unpriced stuff that effectively is slavery, meaning all the cost that slaves are bearing by not being paid, by not being provided with material goods and so on and so forth. And if you add that into the economy, that's like an extra 30%. So that's like an order of magnitude more than the sort of direct priced sort of things. If you took slavery away, what would be the impact on GDP? That number has never been thought to be huge. In the British context, also, I showed you the paper where it's like the geography of where the Industrial Revolution is. The aggregate number they get from the impact of slave profits on British GDP is also only like 4%. So the numbers on sort of measurable things are not huge. And even those guys argue that it mattered for where the British Industrial Revolution happened, not necessarily whether it happened or not. And that's something that economic historians have long argued. Eric Williams, who was the president at one point of Trinidad and Tobago, who was also an economic historian, argued that the profits of the slave trade directly caused the British Industrial Revolution. And most economic historians today wouldn't back off that, at least in a quantitative sense. Again, but we're not pricing in a lot of things in that. Thanks. I'm dodging. Oh, wait. Yep.
Were there any cultures in which the slave owners would actually rent out their slaves to other people, or did the slaves always live in the home or in the plantation of the slave owners?
Oh, I think almost every culture that has slavery has some sort of rental arrangements, and that was definitely common in the U.S. South. I mentioned Charles Dew. Charles Dew wrote about this a lot with his study of urban slavery. I can say in serfdom, it's less common. You don't see, or I've barely heard of such arrangements, partly because serfdom's always about those peasants being tied to a particular property. Now, what's interesting with the Russian case is there are examples, and I've seen actually in the archives, sales contracts of serfs without the land. But because it is really sort of a violation of almost the institutional equilibrium, the czar, the sort of powers that be, really try to crack down on such sales of peasants without land by sort of 1830s. And there's a lot of laws that get passed, and people are actually punished. Nobility are punished for trying to sell their serfs without selling the whole estate. Like, you can sell the estate and the peasants sort of go along with it, but in the Russian context, I haven't seen rental agreements, like my peasants are gonna go work for you and you're gonna give me something, although I'm sure they may have existed. I guess at the end of the day, it probably could happen. Two there?
I have a question about your one of your last slides that showed Darity numbers.
Yes.
I understand that Darity is a very strong advocate for reparations. My question is, are his numbers about the cost of slavery generally supported by other economists, or is he regarded as an outlier?
I mean, I want to be careful here. I'm not an Americanist, so I'm not in the sort of immersed in these debates. But I think these numbers, and I'll just put it back up here. These are, I mean, part of the issue is how do we think about these in today's dollars, right? There's a lot going back to the question, what were the costs in terms of GDP? Well, that's actually basically right here. These are sort of the GDP calculation numbers, if you will. And that in today's dollars, I mean, that's a number. But those are far different than these up here, which are really trying to get at more of this, what were the unsort of priced costs that slaves bore for being slaves? That is not anything that we can include and say what national income was, which is what GDP is. And so I think if you do move towards that, and I mentioned this new work by Rick Hornbeck and Trevon Logan, who are scholars who are not sort of arguing directly for reparations per se, like their numbers are approaching these big numbers here, if you compound it forward to 2021. And then there's some issues about, there's a lot of policy debate and discussion about if you were to have reparations, how would one go about doing that? And Bill Bederity, if I urge people, they can take a look. He has a book, I can't remember with which press, Chicago Press, about the case for reparations, where he argues at the end about how you would actually go about doing this and getting towards some, and not even all, like these numbers are not the ones he actually says are possible in a political sense, which obviously probably none of them are possible currently in a political sense. But he's not an outlier, I think, given his assumptions. The question is, do you believe those assumptions? Do you think other assumptions should be applied? I cut off the table. He has a 6% compounding in the same table, and you can imagine that's far bigger. I think the one number is, it's like $700 trillion or something. But it's a good question. It's a question I don't have a great answer for. I think overall, he's the one person that's tried to put hard numbers on this. And you just have to follow his logic as to whether you think that assumption or this assumption are wrong or not.
Do these numbers take into account the profits made by banks, insurance companies, shipbuilders, the secondary, not just from the profit of sale of produced goods?
To some extent, these do. Again, part of this is like the counterfactual is really hard to unpack. Okay, you don't have slavery, so what do those not exist? Do they exist in a different form? And I think these bottom two in particular are they're really just probably looking at the directly affected sectors, so cotton, maybe some like ships. But you're right, the sort of financial industry, right, that would probably move more up into, those maybe in some loose sense priced into the sort of, say, like, what was the slave, like at auction, what were the prices of slaves? In some ways, their value is value that is accruing, right, to insurance companies, to banks, and so on. So in some sense, that is getting closer. So as we move up the table, you're probably implicitly adding some of these other sectors, I would say, right? But I have no idea specifically how closely or not those would be encompassed in these numbers.
And has anybody traced like present-day companies that may have benefited way back then?
Oh yeah, that's definitely something that many people are doing, and you may be aware there's a historian at MIT who's written about colleges and universities and their endowments, right, and how much is sourced from profits during slavery. Yeah, that is definitely something. There's many books out there on. What gentleman has a question?
I think actually have reached the end of our time together, which seems difficult to believe because it's gone very quickly. And we want to thank you so much, Professor Nafziger. That was very interesting.
Thank you.